It's a real pleasure to welcome Malcolm MacGregor. I hadn't seen his work until I saw it in Travelodge, but it was Malcolm who actually was kind enough to write and offer to do something for the group, because he has done it previously. He's been a member of the travel group for longer than I realised, actually. And I'm not going to introduce him at all. I'm going to leave him to do that for himself, because I find that usually what people say about themselves is much more interesting than anything that I might pass on to you having read it. So without further ado, Malcolm MacGregor, thank you very much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kath, and I hope everybody can see me and everything is working. Yes, well, first of all, thank you all for attending this Zoom presentation about the Namib Desert. And I thought that it would probably be better if I sort of talked a little bit about myself before getting into the presentation itself. I left the military in about 1997, joined the RPS in about the year 2000. I actually did a big project in Oman, having left the army, photographic project, and gave a presentation on that in Cheltenham. God, was it? Yes, 23 years ago. And so I got to know the travel group a bit then, and then my sort of life sort of took off photographic wise, and I did a lot of projects in Scotland. I then went back to Oman on numerous occasions. I worked for an organization called the Halo Trust, which was all about humanitarian mine clearance. And I latterly spent some time in Southeast Asia, and then very latterly in Namibia, as I'm about to describe. So I have been a member of the RPS, Royal Photographic Society, for some 20 years, 23 years now. And it's always been great to see what people actually do, where they go, what they photograph. And I do think the standard of the magazine, well, the overall RPS magazine is fantastic. And of course, the Travelodge. And of course, the Travelodge always gives me ideas about places to go and to photograph. Mm-hmm. Anyway, onward. So the title of this presentation is The Namib, A Photographic Journey. And my intention over the next 50 minutes or so is to talk about the Namib Desert from a landscape photographer's point of view. It's not a guided tour of Namibia, but rather what lies within the desert in terms of atmosphere and photographic opportunities. It is more about the inspirational nature of some of the wild and secluded areas of the Namib, many of which can be seen as wilderness locations. This is important because there are precious few countries left in the world that offer such environments for photographers like myself, who take their cue from landscape photographers of the old American West, such as Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Paul Strand. It was they who brought the magnificence of the High Sierra, Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Pacific Coast to the minds of the American public. Whilst I cannot compete with their vision, there are similarities in the way in which I've worked in the Namib and other places like Scotland and Oman over the past 20 years. And I hope to impart some of these ways of working and ideas in this presentation. And I really intend to show 5 areas. First of all, influences on me as a photographer, how photographs can be viewed as mirrors or windows, my way of working, the importance of time in doing any project or any type of photography, connections that exist between countries and regions, and this latter aspect, connections between countries and areas, has become more important to me, because I find that if you go to one area, it gives ideas for other areas. So what was it that made me want to photograph in the wild and desolate areas of the Namib Desert over the period 2019 to 2021. So the story of the Namib project really sort of began some 20 years ago, I guess, in the empty quarter. And the reason for that was to do with memory. And when you spend time in the magnificence of the dunes of the empty quarter, images from there really never leave your mind, and they implant themselves on your mind. And I find that with photography, there are links between places such as deserts, and from that flow ideas. And photography is all about ideas. Another aspect would be a deep affection for the desert landscape, arguably the purest form of landscape, consisting of lines, shapes, and trajectories. The third aspect would be a desire for rediscovery and a sense of connection through intuition and chance photographic encounters. The desire to rediscover those lines, shapes, and forms, but in a different location. And this photograph shows the Namib Desert, the mixture of the dunes and the rocky hills. But it was really time spent in the empty quarter that drove me towards the Namib. The idea of rediscovering connections are interesting themes within photography that would probably warrant a lecture of its own. But time obviously doesn't allow for that. Nor do we have time to discuss those who live on the edge within the empty quarter, namely the Bedu, whose lives chime with those who live on the edge in the Namib Desert, namely the Himba and the Herero people, the campfires of whose ancestors lit the skies above the Namib thousands of years ago and still do today. So it's not just subject matter, more an inner feeling for a place that is important to me, and perhaps even more importantly, continuously developing that inner feeling. This map gives you an idea of the extent of the Namib Desert and the country itself. The country, Namibia, is roughly the same size as France and Germany, 3 times the size of the United Kingdom, with a population of 2.6 million. The capital is in Windhoek, here, and the main towns are Swakopmund and Luderitz down here, which affect the photography. And the rivers that denote the borders, Kunene River up in the north with Angola, and the Orange River in the south with South Africa. The Namib Desert itself stretches for some 2,000 kilometers from the north right along the coast, dropping into the Atlantic at various points. Areas of importance that affect this presentation are, first of all, Kyoko Land in the north, which is where my photographic journey began, the Skeleton Coast, Sandwich Harbour, Kolmanskop, which is a ghost town, and Sossusvlei in the Namib Naukluft Desert up in this area here. So my journey began, covered 2 trips, I should say, to Namibia, initially for 2 weeks and then for a month. And it began up in the north, and I worked my way down to Kolmanskop down in the south, in the southern part of the Namib Desert. So what I intend to do now is take you on that journey that I followed, and I'll be looking at themes and ideas that were thrown up by photography in this remarkable desert. And as I've already mentioned, photography is about ideas and how those ideas actually become tangible photographs. This is a photograph of the Kunene River up in the north, which borders with Angola. And it has been said that there are 2 kinds of photographs. The book Mirrors and Windows by John Sarkowski was published in 1978. And in the book, Sarkowski asks whether a photograph is a mirror or a window. A mirror tends to reflect a portrait of the artist who made it. A window is a photograph through which one may better get to know the world. These photographs are generally illustrative in content, such as postcards, magazine articles, and the like. The mirror photograph is a very different kettle of fish. But this book that I did on the Namib desert really made me think about my own photography going back some 20 years. And what I've ended up doing, I like to think, is creating really both windows and mirrors. Because I think if you're trying to explain something, you need to be able to present to the viewer windows onto the world and what they are actually looking at. So this photograph of the Kanani River, which represents the northernmost border of Namibia with Angola, I think could be regarded as a window. It's information. It's telling you what the river looks like. It's showing you the banks and the light and the dense cloud. The next photograph might be slightly different. And this is the same river, the Kanani, from roughly the same area. And those who view photography as a mirror are suggesting that an image is some kind of portrait of the photographer who took it. Additionally, the photograph might have some sort of meaning and is more likely to create a reaction in the viewer. Normally, such a photograph is tightly framed, as you can see with this one, so that the photographer's eyes and mind cannot wander. In this particular photograph of the reeds on the Kanani River, there may be feelings of being carefree, at ease in the environment, watching and listening to the reeds swishing in the wind, maybe birds flying around over the water. Whilst all the time, the emerald green river meanders its way westwards to the Atlantic Ocean. So mirrors and windows is a catchphrase that's worth keeping in mind and that I've always really thought about continuously in my photographic life. So from the Kanani River, the photographs or the photography took me down south to a place called the Hartman Valley, one of the most glorious and remote landscapes I have ever encountered. You can cut the silence with a knife there. And here we have two dunes in the foreground, the valley in the middle, topped off with the sky. So a fairly easygoing composition as the dunes lead the viewer to the clouds from the dunes in the foreground. I've got the second photograph here of the same area made on the following day. And this time there's a strong light striking this foreground dune here, whilst the dune, quite by chance, is in a slightly darker area, which makes for an interesting composition to start with before one gets onto mirrors and windows. And in the depth is the mountain, and in the deep depth, it just so happens that the cloud works its way into the gap between this mountain here and the ridgeline. Now, I think both those pictures are probably windows. Through the photography, I am explaining what the Hartman Valley looks like, what it consists of. But they are important pictures in explaining or showing the environment in which I was working. So here I count for 5 days in this remote part of Africa with two companions, Pierre Jeunet from France and Eric Noir, his cousin from Switzerland. When you spend time in one location like the Hartman, you really get to know an area, you really get to know it. And that is a very important factor in travel photography, landscape photography, is time. You need the time no matter what. You get to understand how light falls across the landscape as you observe light and shadow and the nuances of that light and shadow at different times of day. The more a photographer gets to know a location, the greater the chance of a photograph being a mirror, reflecting something of the inner self, reflecting something of the photographer, as I intend to show in the next two photographs. Here I have compressed the scene with a telephoto lens, emphasizing shadows, lines, and depth. The evolving light, which moved across the dunes, creating the shadows, and is perhaps a mirror photograph. This is the same area the following morning. And it was really the pink light of the dawn that attracted me right back to the same area. The dunes changed their colors throughout the day, but particularly at dawn and first light, it moves, the light and the color of the light moves very quickly from something like this to that. So when I saw these two compositions on two different mornings, sorry, that one and that one, I really felt something inside of me that this was where I should be. This is what the desert of the Hartmann really meant to me. Photography is all about light and is brilliant at capturing fleeting moments. This again was on the third morning, this photograph, where I was really homing in on the dunes and the light falling on the dunes. Chance encounter again. I hadn't really aimed to photograph this particular dune, but I noticed the way the light was falling on it. And the foreground is darkened somewhat compared to the lit area, and dark against light, as the great Charlie Waite always used to say, is always a winner. So that is one photograph from this area, and here is the other one. And here we have a slightly different composition with this very dark area here, making the composition slightly more edgy, and the light just falling very nicely on these dune ripples, as you can see. Deserts provide great opportunities for abstraction in photography. In fact, Ansel Adams himself didn't specialize in it, but he called them extractions, which is perhaps a better way to call these abstractions. So they're really extractions, and you are extracting a landscape from the desert and making it into a photograph. Great landscapes create themselves, so wrote Karen Blixen in her book, Out of Africa. And this is the great landscape of the Horosib Valley, which leads out of Keiko land, where I was in the north, down towards the Skeleton Coast. And here we spent the night on a high ridge line, looking down on the valley, which we had driven down to get to the Skeleton Coast. And it's one of the routes from Keiko land onto the coastline. But within that valley are extraordinary compositions and formations and contrasts of color, the deep black of this basalt rock with the light just touching the foreground, balanced with the white sand of the dune in front of it. So I'm just going to pause it if there are any questions at this stage. on the chat thing.
There are none in chat, but if anybody would like to come in with one, now is your opportunity. If you're all muted at the moment, so if anybody does have a question, you will need to unmute yourself. No, I think you're just keeping us
Okay,
stunned, actually, Malcolm.
Okay. Right. So the next stage, as I said, the Horosive Valley took me down to the Skeleton Coast.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. There's one question. What time of year was this trip?
The first time, right. It was March 2020, no, March 2019. And then that was the first trip. So that photograph was March 2019, as was this photograph. The previous photographs were all made in November 2020. So I did 2 trips, one of 2 weeks, which was really exploratory. And then I went back to really get stuck in. You know, I had the idea for a book, and I decided I was going to really do this.
Yeah.
So that's why I went back for a month.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Okay. Right, Skeleton Coast. The Skeleton Coast is sometimes called the Coast of Loneliness for good reason. And here there are vast tracts of coastline with no human presence whatsoever. Nothing but the sound of waves and waves crashing on rocks endlessly, and misshapen rocks, extraordinary sort of formations of rocks and layout and symbolic in many ways, as you can see in this picture. But how did it get its name, the Skeleton Coast? Well, the cold Benguela current from Antarctica comes north and meets the warm air of the Namib desert, which causes a grey veil of mist, which you can sort of see in the depth here, enveloping the coast up to 2 miles inland, more or less every day of the year, which is great for the sort of photography I like doing. So you can get onto the Skeleton Coast. You've got no harsh, bright areas, no deep, dark areas. So it makes it great for photography on the coast. But it was not so great for those who were navigating ships and vessels going round or coming down the coast of Southern Africa, say from Europe, and heading to Cape Town or Walvis Bay in Namibia. And the coastline is littered, well, that's probably putting it a bit strongly, but there are a lot of shipwrecks along the coastline, which indeed have been much photographed. And this is a photograph of the Zila, which came to ground in Henties Bay, just north of Swakopmund, and is pretty accessible for photography. And the Zila ran aground in 2008, where the captain and the navigator and the bridge crew on the bridge got totally disorientated, basically, as they were trying to get down to Walvis Bay. Another aspect of the Skeleton Coast, which I found fascinating, is the bones. And obviously skeleton equals bones. And all sorts of bones have been found on the coastline. And this is a whale bone. And rather in the fashion of Georgia O'Keeffe, of whom I'm a great fan, I was very keen to photograph bones within the location of the Skeleton Coast. So I wasn't picking them up and taking them anywhere and positioning them. I photographed them in situ, as it was evocative. And you can see the layout of this bone. It just sort of leads you into the coast, into the desert area of the Skeleton Coast and into the Namib. The the Skeleton Coast may well have been the resting ground for many vessels and mammals, as already alluded to. But I really was searching for something else, an alternative realm, if you like, of misshapen rocks set in a haunting landscape on the or in a haunting coastline. And it was really this sort of shape of rocks that I was looking for, and particularly this one over on the right, which sort of balances itself very nicely with this one here. And it was just such a simple photograph done at about 7 o'clock in the morning. As you can see, the fog, the mist was in depth. So there was no clear blue sky. Suits me perfectly. Another idea, another example, where the light of the day, the fog was really holding the light back really nicely every day that I was there, so that I could really spend time looking for compositions, setting my camera up, looking for extraordinary rock formations, trying to set the scene within the coastline itself. And then you come across muscular rocks like this, and you get set up, get everything set, and make the photograph. But it wasn't just great rocks leading out into the sea that determined the photograph. There were these isolated rock pools which you could discover if you looked hard enough, and full of character, and just another aspect that I was fortunate to find on the Skeleton Coast. Indeed, on most coastlines, you can find this sort of thing, but you do have to look. So not only are you looking outwards, but you're looking downwards, looking for compositions continuously, framing trying to frame a photograph on the LCD screen or through the viewfinder. But I think the reason I did this photograph really was that it was a theme of tranquility amongst the crashing waves and the sheer noise of the coastline. And as you can see, there was not a glimmer of ripple on the seawater that was in this rock pool. And as I'm sure you all know, polarizer filter on, and you'll keep any glare out of such a rock pool. Another variation I found was this balancing rock, or what I call the balancing rock, which attracted me. It's a bit much lighter now. It was another day, and I was looking in another completely different area of the Skeleton Coast around Toro Bay. And yes, and as the great Michael Kenner said, if you're on your feet long enough, you'll find what you're looking for. And this rock stood out for me, unfettered by the force of the sea. Texture in the boulder was very important. That's what I really noticed. And cameras or photography is very good at picking up texture. A bit further down the coastline, a bit further inland from Toro Bay, was this sort of formation of black basalt rock being harshly struck by the midday light, but softened by the dune in the background. And that's really why I was attracted to this composition. You got this sort of ridge line going like this, and it drops down, and then suddenly you're into a dune, and it goes like this, and the rocks again, and it's just the light colored sand against the harsh black made a nice contrast. And I think this photograph for me sort of sums up my time on the Skeleton Coast, where I spent about 5 days. Harsh crashing waves, fog, the cacophony of these stones in the foreground being ripped out to sea by the current. The waves come in and they drag the stones out in a cacophony of noise out into the sea, back out into the Benguela current, which is causing the fog in depth in the picture there. So at this stage, are there any questions about the Skeleton Coast?
There's a very general question that we're going to hold until the end, but there's nothing here specifically about the Skeleton Coast. If anybody has them, they can add them now. Doesn't sound like it, Malcolm. You're keeping us informed.
Keep going. So my next port of call was Sandwich Harbour, which yes, I mean, technically speaking, the Skeleton Coast was always the northern coastline of Namibia, but now it's really encompasses the entire coastline. And Sandwich Harbour was interesting, or is interesting, because this is the place where the dunes of the Namib drop right into the Atlantic Ocean. It's located 30 miles south of Walvis Bay, and it is just a phenomenal area, as you'll see, or you can see. So what I'm going to do is just explain a bit about how I work when making photographs. And I'm really going to use my experience of being in Sandwich Harbour to explain that. A very important book in the history of photography is by our old friend again, John Sarkowski, called The Photographer's Eye. And I hope you can see that, The Photographer's Eye, which was very influential to me over the years, or has been very influential. It was published in 1980. And in it, he explains four essential aspects for photography, or how to go about making photographs within these four aspects. And the four aspects are the vantage point, framing, selecting the plane of focus, and timing, or making the exposure at the right time. This process has stood me in very good stead for 20 years, as I said, due to its simplicity and how each part meshes in a seamless, natural way. So much so that it very quickly becomes an instinctive way of working. So dealing first with the vantage point, the position from which the photograph is made. In this photograph, I wanted to show the sheer expanse, length, and depth of the dunes in relation to the sea, the Atlantic Ocean. So I needed to get high up into a good overview position. And often in landscape photography, it is necessary to get above the landscape. You can go down, obviously, you can go left or right, but generally speaking, going up is a winner, because you are, as I alluded to earlier, you are presenting a window onto the world. For people that may never have been to the location you are in. So one should always be thinking, am I in the best location for what I want to achieve? Often moving a couple of feet to the right or to the left, forwards or backwards can make a big difference. The second thing is framing. And which is probably the single most important consideration, and is indeed many ways interchangeable with the vantage point, because if you can't frame properly, you've got to move your vantage point. So the two do sort of interact. But what to leave out of the photograph is often more important than what to include. And as Sarkowski says in his book, to quote, out of context is the essence of the photographer's craft. What he calls the line of decision is the picture's edge, the frame. So as you can see, we've got the frame. That is, all of that is the line of decision. And the decision is what goes in and what goes out. So the photographer begins with a frame, and the frame isolates unexpected juxtapositions, such as these ridge lines, and is the beginning of the picture's geometry. In this photograph, to me, when I set up, I immediately thought it looked like the sea, rolling waves. And so I adjusted my vantage point and framing to try and create that feeling that it wasn't really a desert here, but in fact, obviously there's a desert, but what it felt like was waves, troughs and breaking surf and big waves. That's what it really felt like to me. And so that's why I did the photograph. Peaks and troughs in the desert. And I wanted to emphasize that. So I used a telephoto lens at 150 millimeter to cut out extraneous parts of the landscape. And that is one of the great, that's what a telephoto lens does. It cuts out, it zooms in. And everywhere in front of me was a geography of sand where there were no straight lines. Everything was sort of wave-like. Everything was going up and down, left and right. And the telephoto lens was perfect for communicating a feeling, that feeling for waves. So we haven't got the big view of the desert. It's trying to create a feeling for something slightly different. And an interesting thing to do with a camera, get it on the tripod, and then pivot the camera slowly around in a circle, and watch the image change on the LCD screen. And it's revelatory to see how relationships between objects change, whether it's trees and rivers or trees and rocks. And don't bother trying to take a photograph, just really look at that LCD screen. And that's one of the great things about digital photography, is you can think about your ideas, work on them without taking a picture, without really having to think about f-stops or shutter speeds or whatever it is, ISO speeds. So, and it's another way of connecting with the landscape, to see how the relationships work and change. So the third aspect is selecting the plane of focus. So the plane of focus runs horizontally across the frame. It does not work vertically. It runs horizontally across the frame. And critical to this particular photograph was that I wanted this ridge line to be the point of focus, a plane to be right on the plane of focus, so that I could bring the background here into focus along with the foreground here. And I was using, I think it was a 200 millimeter lens. And so it was really critical to get that right. Focused on the ridge line, which gave me a good enough depth of field, stretching front to back in the picture. Framing was very tight again, homing in on the subject matter. And the reason I wanted it tight was to really emphasize the black magnetite rock shale type that was within the sand itself. The Sandwich Harbour area has this black magnetite all over the place, and I saw it as an advantage, really. It contrasted so nicely with the yellowy sand that you find in parts of Sandwich Harbour. Then the fourth aspect is timing, or making the exposure at the right moment, or as Cartier-Bresson called it, the decisive moment. And that was critical in this particular photograph due to the breaking waves and the lines that were being created by the surf lines and moving in and out and working with each other, or creating a photograph for my benefit. And this part is all about judging the right moment to make the exposure. And I sat on this above this, the sea, the Atlantic coming in, sat above the view, the composition, just looking at the waves, looking at how the surf interacted, how they formed lines, and how the sea just rolled in. But when the waves broke around about here, you got this sort of creation in the foreground, and it made a pleasing composition for me anyway. The right moment of exposure. But photographs really only describe the present, and momentarily, like this photograph, and then it is gone. Isolating a single segment of time is particularly so with waves and surf, because you have a moving landscape. The desert and rocks within the doesn't really move. It can in obviously wind, strong wind. But when you're there and you actually see the landscape and the sea moving in front of you, whether you're looking through the viewfinder or whether you're looking at it on the LCD screen, is mesmerizing, and yeah, it's beautiful to watch. But timing is everything. And I guess the master of timing was, of course, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was not really a landscape photographer. He was a documentary photographer primarily, but he has a lot to teach and did teach about timing, as I'm sure you're all aware of his photographs. So to sum up, vantage point, framing, plane of focus, and exposure timing. And in the book I did about the Namib, I go into that in a bit more detail. But that way of working is just so simple and straightforward. I've never really adopted any other way of setting out to get photographs. So are there any questions after that section, Kath?
There's one general question about the accessibility. To what extent are these locations accessible on roads?
Well, right. Well, Sandwich Harbour there are no roads. So you've got to have a four-wheel drive vehicle. And I would strongly advise you to take a guide, which is what I did. And you can pick guides up in Walvis Bay, no problem at all. Skeleton Coast, there are roads. In fact, there are roads. The road up the Skeleton Coast extends really from Walvis Bay all the way north to a place called Terrace Bay, where I based myself. You can go off-road, but you need to be very careful of getting bogged in. And if you're on your own, which I was a lot of the time, you can't afford to do that. So I would park and walk. And that is the best way to do it if you're on your own. Obviously, even if you're with a group, I would advise park and walk. And up in the far north, Hartman Valley, it was all based on tracks, and we traveled around in the good old Land Rover Defender 110, which Land Rover in their wisdom have discontinued. Big mistake. Anyway, we rigged it all up for Pierre and I for this trip into the Hartman Valley.
Thank you. There are a couple of more general ones, but they're more suited to the end, so we'll hang on to them for summaries. Thanks.
Right. Okay, thank you. Right. The next stage of this journey was a place called Colemanskop. One of the unexpected parts of the Namib Desert is the presence of this ghost town called Kolmanskop within the dunes of the desert, as you can see from this photograph. The town itself was founded in 1909 and named after a wagon driver called Johnny Coleman. Located near Luderitz in the south, diamonds were found on the surface of the sand, shining so brightly they could be picked up by moonlight. And so the town of Kolmanskop was built in the desert under German management and the colonial government at the time. It was the home to some 800 people, consisting of houses, a school, a hospital, a butchery, a bakery, swimming pool, a theater, and a lot more. It is an unbelievable place. The town stood until 1956, when the last of the diamonds were extracted and the mine was closed. But what is left is a legacy of how a town that dominated the desert was in turn taken over by the desert. I spent 2 days here, and I needed that length of time to immerse myself in the remains of Kolmanskop, constantly searching for compositions that spoke to me or appealed to me, like this one of the windows in the school, which swung with a creaking sound as they were caught by the wind, and one could almost hear the laughter of children in the background. Kolmanskop consists of a lot of ruined houses, or not completely ruined, but still there, and archways, entrances acted as framing devices. So when you talk about framing, I was really thinking about not just vantage point, but the framing, or framing and vantage point all became one. Doorways led to other doorways and yet more photographs. So you would go into, you'd set yourself up, photograph this, and then there was something that would lead you in. So you'd go in here and you'd find something else, and a window up here. And it's extraordinary how doorways, empty doorways anywhere, and ghost towns lead you into not just the eye, but lead you physically into another area. Here I'm really trying to pick up the texture on the door on the left, with just a smidgen of light in depth that you can see here. And I think that's what sort of makes the photograph. And the colorful walls, the color of the wallpaper is still there from 120 years ago. Rusted lavatories, sinks, pipes, and baths, some of which find their way into the dunes. And although somewhat humorous, this photograph is obviously about lines. And I referred to lines earlier on. No straight lines at Sandwich Harbour. Well, here was a really straight line, albeit at an angle, which sort of balanced the bath. Anyway, it was a humorous thing. I don't know if the bath is still there. Maybe somebody can go and report back. And then within the houses themselves are the remains of beautifully decorated banisters and interiors. You can really get a feel for how people lived. And this handrail, just two simple colors of brown and blue, or light blue, against a light blue wallpaper background, is what appealed to me. And again, I'm really using a telephoto lens to really home in on it, really take advantage of what photography can do, which is texture, and eliminate anything that was sort of unnecessary to the photograph. So that's Kolmanskop. Any questions on that?
No question so far, but an update. The
An up
bath was there in July this year.
Hooray! Right. Okay. Good to know.
It was also there in 2018, apparently.
Was it? Right. Okay. Okay. We won't ask how it got there. That would ruin the story. Okay. On to Saucer's fly. This photograph I did from a hot air balloon, and I mentioned earlier about getting high, getting above the landscape. Well, you can't do much better than getting in an aircraft or a balloon or something like that. And this photograph was made at dawn. Again, I was lucky, well, just after dawn, in that it was an overcast day, which is the reason for these shadows. Light against shadow, against light, against shadow, and so forth, leading you into the photograph. So compositionally, it's quite strong. Now, the Namib Desert is the oldest in the world at some 55 million years old. But despite its age, the colors retain a rich intensity. On the pale colored dunes around Sandwich Harbor, which we've looked at, to the redder colors and more orangey colors around Sossusvlei, which is right in the heart of the desert. So we're now quite away from the coastline. And as I said, this picture, I'm high up in the dune, and it's it's a window type photograph to give you a feel for the desert, or the area of Sossusvlei, I should say. But contrasting with that, you get down onto the ground and you get soft light against the harsh light of sunset. And that's a sand dune, huge sand dune, where the setting sun is just sort of touching that without touching the foreground dune there. And again, not including a skyline makes the viewer totally focus on the composition of this simple composition, and the simpler a composition can be, the better in photography. Well known with it at Sossusvlei is the camel thorn trees in a place called Deadvlei. And Deadvlei means dead pan. It is a large depression baked by the heat of the sun. And here is a bony collection of camel thorn trees which died some 700 years ago when the water dried up and the dunes cut the Vlai from the river, which kept the Vlai watered. This composition makes use of one of the key attributes of photography, which I mentioned before, and that's the ability to render texture. Framing was very important here to block out the unexciting sky and to emphasize the camel thorns, to make the camel thorns, if you like, look like something else, like a sort of praying mantis, and carefully frame the camel thorn from the left, picking up the texture whilst overarching the dune and other camel thorn trees. As for the Skeleton Coast itself, mist adds a dimension to any photograph. It combines mystery and simplicity. But so you ask yourself, where does this dune lead to? And this was a dune called Dune 45. Where does it lead to? Where is it going? The sense of the unknown is always created by mist and fog, and photography is very good at creating that sense of the unknown. As the mist rises, so the landscape is revealed. Now, I knew again I had to get high, and I made my way up to the top of Dune 45 in the mist, and I had no idea what to expect when the mist lifted at about 8:30 in the morning. And the clearing mist only lasted about 15 minutes. And I was up there on my own, and this panorama just presented itself to me. And the depth of landscape, which is what I was in the back of my mind was looking for, just presented itself to me, and I was in the right place at the right time, with the light really softly touching this forward dune here. And the reason it was soft was because of the mist. So mist is a great friend of the photographer, in my opinion. Mist and fog is great, as we've experienced recently up here, up in the hills of the borders. So this book project began with detailed preparation in Scotland, where I live, some 8,000 miles from the Namib desert. But advancing on the Namib, or indeed anywhere, hoping for the best, is a futile operation. To avoid that, one must have what Ralph Gibson calls a point of departure, and indeed other photographers. And this can be ideas or themes to be sought out. Timelessness, solitude, and isolation were my points of departure. You might set out to photograph the way water flows over rocks, or the way dunes connect or interact with each other, as in this photograph. But as you are looking for these themes within the landscape, you will get a feel for something in the air, and I guarantee you will find something. And it may not be exactly what you're looking for, but there will be that feel in the air that you are in the presence of a photograph. In the case of this photograph, I had passed these dunes and ignored them. But by the time I was returning to my vehicle and the sun was going down, I sensed the colors changing from orange to magenta. Within that, I wanted to photograph the connectedness of the dunes as rolling forms of light and color. So just after I established my vantage point, a last burst of light came through and illuminated this area here, illuminating the background in a totally unexpected way, an unexpected light, you might say. So the idea of connectedness was my point of departure. The penetrating soft light made for a different photograph to what was actually in my mind. Photography is also about new perspectives and destinations. I never dreamt that my time spent in the empty quarter would spawn a photographic project in the Namib desert. The evolving photographer must identify the points on an imaginary compass that give a sense of direction in the quest for new horizons of light, time, and space. And if you are on your feet long enough, you will eventually find what you are looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malcolm. There are some questions, so let's put the ones that we've got already, and then there may be others that are added, and that would be fine. The first question that I was going to bring in at this stage, we haven't seen any wildlife. Did you?
I did. I saw a lot of wildlife. I went to Etosha Park and I photographed rhino, lion, and elephant, deer. But my theme developed very quickly that landscape was what Namibia was about for me. Now, that's not to say wildlife is not important to other people. Well, wildlife is important, and it was a great photographic experience, and there is a lot of wildlife to be had. But if I'd included wildlife in this book, I'd have been opening up a whole nother point of departure, if you like. And it has been one departure too many for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I guess that's a good way to put it. It wasn't one of your points of departure.
correct. But if you're going to go to Namibia, you might as well, if you're there, go and try and see the wild. I mean, I did actually see wildlife up near the Skeleton Coast. Quite a lot, actually, elephant and dick and antelope and so forth. Yeah.
And if you weren't plagued by wildlife, were you plagued by other groups of photographers?
Funnily enough, I wasn't, except actually Sossusvlei. Now,
right.
Yes, where we are here in this photograph. At Dune 45 was the only other place I saw any other photographers. That whole area with the camel thorns is one of the great magnets of the world for photography. I mean, another one would be Yosemite, where it's right up there. And Dune 45, it was actually quite interesting. The mist was there, and there was a group of they were young photographers, and they were all. I'd got there well ahead of them. Anyway, I got up to the top, and it was just mist everywhere. You couldn't see anything. And by 7:30, they were getting quite sort of, oh well, there's no point staying here. This is going to be like this all day. And I sort of thought, well, shall I encourage them to go or say nothing? And I thought, well, I'll just say nothing. And they did go. And at 8:30, that mist lifted. And the mist lifted, and I could see them way down at the bottom in their vehicles and stopping and thinking, obviously saying, oh my God, we should have stayed up there. And the other one is Deadfly, the camel thorns, where you will see a lot of other photographers, and it is very difficult to get pictures without other people in your frame. Now, the way to get around that is to make sure you stay in a lodge within the game park, within the park itself. And not only that, go very early at night, in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and get there. And I had a bit of a set too where I was staying, and they said, oh, you can't leave till 5 o'clock. And I said, right. And I left at 4:30, just went. I knew I had to get there. And also you need to do a pre-recce. So you need to get there the day before, because you need to be very careful where you're driving, because the last bit getting into Deadfly is on a sand track. And if you haven't got you won't get through it unless you've got a full-wheel drive. I mean, obviously the solution is to use a guide, but I knew where I was going because I'd been there on the previous trip. On the short 2-week trip, I'd already been to Sossusvlei, so I sussed it out a bit. And sorry, yes, that was about it. That was the only place where I saw other photographers. Nowhere else.
I think you also mentioned when John and I were talking to you earlier about Kolmankop and staying late or getting there early in the same way.
Yes, Kolmankop. The thing to do with Kolmankop is to get a special pass. Very easy to do. You can actually get it at Kolmankop itself, which gives you 24-hour access.
Right.
And so there's no point trying to there were 1 or 2 other photographers there, but generally the people turn up in groups and they get a tour around during the day. But the special pass allows you to get there anytime you want. You can do night photography there if you really want to. And you can, but the great thing about that is you have the place to yourself. And maybe, if you're unlucky, another photographer, but and you just get the place to yourself and you work your way in and out of these houses and these buildings. And just by the virtue of being there on your own, you develop a real feel for the place. And all you can hear is the wind and just the click of your camera. And you're not so you need to be there really when there isn't anybody else there.
Talking about it like that, you almost sound as though you're imagining yourself back there. Actually, it's quite interesting. your namesake, Malcolm, asks, what differences do you see between the deserts in Namibia and Oman?
Right. I think with Oman, apart from the expanse of Oman, of the empty quarter, is mind-boggling. Although the Namib desert is the oldest, it's not that it's quite compact when compared to the empty quarter. And there's a good 150-kilometer drive from the roadhead before you even get to the dunes in the empty quarter. And you've really got to know what you're doing there. With the Namib desert, you can just drive into Sossusvlei. There's, a good graded tracks into Sossusvlei. If you go up the Skeleton Coast, the dunes are all there. You can just park up and walk in. Up in the north is a different matter. It's a bit more like the empty quarter, but it's not the same. The empty quarter is just huge rolling dunes, dune field after dune field after dune field. And as I say, there's a real sense of getting to those big dunes in the empty quarter. I used to go in from a place called Salala, and then you move north on the road to a place called Thumrate, and that's where the turnoff is. And if you don't get that turnoff, you've got to find another turnoff. But that turnoff takes you right into the heart of the empty quarter, and it's the size of the empty quarter. And the fact that, yes, there are Bedu that live there, but you see more, I saw more people in the Namib, by that I mean the Himba and the Herero, indigenous people, than I did Bedu in the empty quarter.
Interesting. A couple of questions about your own safety and your gear's safety. One person, John, asks, did you need to be careful of the more dangerous flora and fauna?
Not really. I always wear very tough boots. I always wear trousers. I never wear shorts unless I'm back at base. I always wear a long sleeve shirt. Always wear a hat. But the key thing are boots. And people think you can just sort of do all this sort of thing in flip-flops. You can't. And it's not just any old boot. It's, above the ankle. It's low. The boots come up to the lower shin. And you need those sorts of boots. And you can keep going all day long. And the rock and everything is hot, and you just won't feel that heat coming through the boot. And now you would really emphasize a good pair of boots. So I didn't feel I wasn't in any danger from anything, really. I mean, I'd have been unlucky. I could have been bitten by a snake, but the snake would have had to have bitten me above my boot, and that would have been very unlucky, and through my trousers.
Gosh.
And people make a mistake by thinking, oh, we can just do all this on wearing a pair of shorts, and then you get sunburnt, you get bitten, you get mosquitoes, or whatever it is. Just cover up, and you guarantee you'll be fine.
And about your equipment, Chris asks, did you take any extra precautions to protect your equipment from the wind and sand?
Yes, I use, there are two things I use. What are they called? Those sort of fold away bags, stowage bags, anyway, that roll up into nothing. And if the wind is coming in, you just throw the whole bag over. They'll roll up sort of stowage bags, and you just put you find a nice big one and you put it over the whole camera, which I normally have on a tripod anyway. The other thing is I use shower caps for the lens, for the front of the lenses and the back. And changing lenses is a problem because, well, you've got to do that properly, put your back to the wind, keep the camera face down, take the lens off, other lens on. And you should, I would never even bother trying to change a lens when there's a wind and sand is blowing around. Just don't bother. It's not worth it. Just wait till it dies down or come back another day or whatever.
That's got us to the end of the questions that I have there, Malcolm. Right. Would you like to stop sharing your screen and then we can go to gallery and give everyone a chance to chip in.
Okay, yeah, sure. Are we there? Yep.
Lovely. And go to gallery view.
Gallery view.
Do, by all means, folks, turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves, because John Hunting, I can't see you on the screen, but you might like to make your comment to Malcolm that you just wrote to me. Can't see John there. John is it's Malcolm, actually. Malcolm War. Can I see Malcolm there? No? Yes, I can. Malcolm, you told me that you agreed with Malcolm because you'd had a similar experience.
Yeah, I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf. And in fact, I think I met Malcolm in Oman at some point. And
great memory.
What he's advocated is absolutely true. You can stand in a desert, and particularly at the morning or an evening, and it's just absolutely mind-boggling the way the light changes and can change so quickly. And he's just shown a marvelous selection of pictures, which are very evocative for me, and certainly take me all the way back to my time in the empty quarter, some almost 30 years ago. So thanks very much, Malcolm.
Well, thank you for your kind comments, Malcolm, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Has anybody else got any comments or questions that they'd like to make at this point or ask at this point? I can't see the chat at the moment, so if anybody knows, nothing there. Okay. Anything else anybody'd like to say? If not, I'm going to say a huge thank you, Malcolm. That was lovely.
Like the side way of getting.
That was really a great way to take us through places that I think some people have already visited and others aspire to visit. So thank you for that. And here's to the hoping that some people actually come back with pretty good photographs, having seen what's possible. But knowing that the effort involved is probably greater than most of us would wish to take on a summer holiday. It needs to be a special trip, I reckon.
Yes. Yes, I think if anybody is going to Namibia, it by definition, it becomes a special trip.
Yeah.
I would strongly advise a lot of research, and I would happily help out. If you want to get my email from Kath or John or whoever, I've done 2 trips. I was lucky with the photography, or from just 2 trips. Oman, I did numerous trips to work to get the photographs I wanted there. And I know the area quite well. I don't know the south around Fish River Canyon and all that sort of area. And actually, when I was planning this book project, I thought I was going to do the whole of Namibia, but then I realized pretty quickly that it was just too big a project, and I need even more time. And I think with book projects or photographic projects, the more focused you can be, the better. Because otherwise things can get unwieldy and you can begin to lose control. But yes, so if anybody is going, I'm more than happy to advise in any way and help in any way I can. It's a great country to travel around in. Namibia for landscape, Botswana for wildlife, I think is what they say. But anyway, that aside, thank you very much for having me. It's been a great afternoon, and
I think you've got a little bit more to do yet. A couple more questions coming in.
Oh, right. Okay.
Mark, you've got your hand up. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. I just wanted to say, if anybody's thinking of going to Namibia around about this time of year, don't underestimate how hot it can be. It was absolutely staggeringly hot, 45 degrees.
Yeah.
Even the locals were complaining. And I have to say that, I'm reasonably okay, but I found it very, very hard. Also, I think this particular season, we were much luckier in a way with the light in the desert because we didn't get all the mist, and the desert lights were just brilliant. And just picking up on something you said a moment ago, Malcolm, Botswana for wildlife and Namibia for the rest. We saw the most amazing amount of wildlife in Etosha. Amazing.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Pretty well everything except a leopard.
Yeah.
Lots of it.
Yeah.
I think although it's quite hard to get to, getting there was definitely worth the effort.
Mm.
Yes. I mean, Etosha is a good place. And the great thing about Etosha is you can just drive around in your own car.
Yes, but you're not allowed to go off the road.
No, that's right. That's right. But there was enough to photograph, as I recall. Yeah, I think that's right. Or we stayed in a lodge somewhere near Etosha as well, and we went in guided vehicles. So you couldn't take your vehicle on that. But within Etosha, yes, you do have to stay on the road. But there seemed to be so many options of where you could go, and it was quite enjoyable, actually.
There's another question here about, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, just to say it was a break from the landscape, which is no bad thing, actually.
Yeah. There's another question here that is from John Kagenvan asking, do you use filters on your lenses?
Yes, I do. And I
You
did.
mentioned, yeah.
I did. Maybe I use graduated filters, which basically holds back bright areas in the sky, and polarizer, either together or separately.
Yes,
depending.
you mentioned polarizers with your rock pool photograph, didn't you?
Yeah, and I mean, there are people that say, well, with Lightroom and Photoshop now, you don't really need to use graduated filters, because you can adjust, with the thing in Lightroom where you can just hit sky, and the sky you can darken the sky, which is fine. But it's just, I originally started I used to do a lot of 4:5 large format, and I developed a way of working using filters, graduated and polarizer on that camera. And I just like getting it. It's just a hangover from the past. I like to get it right in camera. And it's more satisfying knowing that you've got the picture in the field rather than saying, oh, well, I'll do it in Lightroom, Photoshop, Capture One or whatever it is when I get back.
Yeah. And there's one really important question that I deliberately kept until the end and then very nearly forgot. So I'm glad we've talked. And it's from Andy Pinch, whom you might know because he's part of the Scottish Brigade, I think, aren't you, Andy? You part of the Scotland Brigade?
Well, I was until recently, but now part of the Yorkshire Brigade.
Oh, okay.
Back to God's own country by God.
So Andy's asking, do you set out to create mirror images or window images, or does it depend on the situation?
Well, I set out to create mirror images. That's what I set out to do. But that's only sort of latterly, really. But as I said, I think both are important, because sometimes you'll have a fantastic grand landscape, great sort of vista, and the light is all perfect. And then the question, and so you do the photograph, and then the question is, well, is that a mirror or a window? And I suggest that is probably a window. But the mirror type image, I think, is what photographers should be aspiring to, because you develop your own style by that. You don't just turn up and say, great picture, I'm going to photo you. You're thinking very hard about what's in front of you, what you're looking at, and you're thinking about your framing and vantage point, and can I make something of this? And I was up in Ardnamurchan last week, and everything I did, I reckon, in my view, was a mirror. Very few grand landscapes. There were just amazing sort of trees interacting with other trees, reflections on Loch Sunat, and it's the other loch up there. Anyway, Loch Aelot, and so I strive for the mirror type of image, and I think by doing that, you or I am saying something about myself rather than producing a photograph that could easily be somebody else's photograph. And that's a thing, actually, to be very careful of following too many other photographers, particularly on Instagram, and because there are incredible photographs and photographers out there, but you need to find people need to find their own voice, and it took me a long time, at least 10 years, to do that. I mean, I was lucky with Oman because there were hardly any photographic books about Oman, and I was able to develop my own way of doing things, my own way of seeing, with hardly any influence at all. That didn't mean to say I didn't go on other people's workshops to learn certain techniques, and particularly when it came to large format and how to actually use a large format camera. But yeah, I think I try to strive for mirrors because there's more of me in the mirror photographs than the grand landscape. The grand landscape you need for books and so forth, because you need to explain to people what it is they're looking at, I think. But you need to do it in not just a technically competent way, but in an original way.
Thank you. Vicky, would you like to unmute yourself and read what you wrote in the chat? Or say it?
Yeah, no, I was going to go in and say, yeah, no, just again, thanks from me for such an insight to the Namib, but also, as you've just been talking about, your thinking behind and what you're hoping to bring when you're photographing. And I found it really inspiring. I enjoy rocks, and so I really enjoy some of your rock photography. It looks some really interesting bits of the Namib. I've not been there. I know people that have, so just wanted to say thank you very much, because this has been a talk of many dimensions, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky, for saying so, and it's very kind. I'm glad I've managed to impart something of use.
I think Vicky speaks for all of us. I've got another question now. Toby asks, money. Did you get any funding assistance for either Oman or Namib?
Oman I did, but not the Namib. Yeah, I mean, I was lucky with Oman in that well, it's a long story, but I found a publisher who published my first ever book called Wilderness Oman. And and I was able to go back and do other projects there based on that book. Corporate type projects, if you like.
And what we'll do when we put the recording up, we'll put a link to Malcolm's website so that you can see some of those things. We'll do our best to keep in touch. If you are a member of the travel group, if you look at the travel log before the one that you received in the last week, you'll find that there's an article from him in it. And some of the images that we've seen today, you'll find reprinted in that article, I think. So you can refresh your memories that way. But again, huge thanks, Malcolm, for a really good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to all of you for joining us. It wouldn't be a good afternoon without people joining us. So thank you for that. And we hope we'll see many of you again in January. January the 21st, we have Jamie Furlong talking about Follow the Boat. And if you've looked at your most recent travelogue, if you've received it now, you'll find there's an article by Jamie in there.